thank you all for being here. I very much appreciate having the opportunity to talk to you here today and talking about AI, right? Because AI is everywhere, right? We have it on our phones, we see people using it at school, at work. Right now, whenever we Google something, we get this weird little blurb at the AI overview, and of course, we can't escape the current AI-generated image trace, right? Now, there's a lot of good reasons as to why we may want to use AI, right? And if we look at recent reports, those show us that, well, AI improves productivity, right? It allows us to do things quicker, right, with more efficiency. Some people also argue, well, it's also further encouraging human creativity, right? We get all of these cool tools that we can now use for the first time, right? Think about technological and scientific discovery, right? Think about how it can speed up research and the massive accomplishments that come with that, right? And we also can think about, very broadly, the social and economic potential, which again, some reports estimate it could be in the trillions of wealth that would be created worldwide. Now, beyond this kind of general value of AI, there's also the issue about democracy, right? And again, a lot of people here are arguing that, well, it's not just that AI is increasing creativity, say, it's also democratizing creativity, right? It's, we can think about AI as democratizing access to knowledge and skills, as democratizing education, right? Opening up the channels for information, right? And as some people put it, also democratizing government, right? Democratizing the way that we communicate with our elected officials, democratizing the data that governments use to make decisions, right? So maybe nobody has put it better than Apple, as they advertise us having Apple Intelligence here in our phones, right? The way that they put it is that it is AI for the rest of us, right? So no longer concealed in highly specialized research labs, no longer concealed in top secret government headquarters, right? No longer concealed by corporate executives, right? It's not just AI, right, as it were exclusively for them, right? It's AI in our hands, this computational power, AI for the rest of us. So this is what I would like to invite us to think through here today, right? To what extent is AI inherently democratic, right? To what extent does me having AI here now in my pocket make me a better democratic citizen? To what extent does us having AI in our pockets make for a better democracy as a whole? So to offer one potential response to this question, I suggest that we go back in time a little bit and we can think about that period immediately following World War II, the moment of the Cold War, when there was this political tension between the US and Russia. And what we saw was a number of massive technological achievements, right? We saw the first all-purpose digital computer being built. For the first time, we had this conversation about artificial intelligence, what it means for something to be intelligent, how to distinguish human between artificial intelligence, a lot of advances in cybernetics, in robotics, right, in this kind of military command and control structures. But in the midst of all this, perhaps the most important technological achievement was that in 1962, when Paul Baran presented the ideas that gave way to what is now the internet, right? So in Rand Corporation, again, Paul Baran, within the context of the Cold War, right? So this tension between the US and Russia, and the US experiencing the fear of nuclear strike from Russia, was that Baran presented the idea for a distributed network of communication, right? His idea was that, well, if you have a centralized network, right? So if you have a centralized military or information network, right, where there's one centralized headquarters, and those headquarters are taken out, right, well, then your whole system is down. But if you have a decentralized system, right, where you have nodes operating somewhat independently from each other, well, then maybe one of those nodes is taken down, but you still have a functioning system. Now, the idea was, what if we build a distributed network, right? One where these nodes are operating more or less independently from each other. And then if one of these nodes is taken out, well, again, you still have a system here that is operating at very high capacity. So the idea at the time was that this act of decentralization, of information, of power, right, in many ways, would provide the affordances that would allow, again, for democracy to prevail over what was perceived to be the Russian threat of the time, right? It was an opportunity for liberation from some of these political concerns. Now, here's the interesting bit, right? Because a lot of these developments were taking place precisely in RAND Corporation, which is based in Santa Monica, California. And this is the 1960s, right? So from the audience, can anybody tell me what else was going on in California in the 1960s? Yes, Paul?
Well, I know there was a Berkeley free speech protest.
Right. So, yeah. Countercultural movement, right? A lot of political protests were taking place at the time, right? So the countercultural movement, which again was predicated upon a perceived threat from what, again, they perceived to be increasingly authoritarian sources, increasingly authoritarian decisions, right? And, you know, as very clearly the movement professed, right? They saw this as a threat to peace and love, right? Now, very clearly what started to happen at the time was that as this kind of anti-establishment movement was taking place, again, alongside this military and political developments, is that the two started to come together in very interesting ways. Right? So the countercultural movement in many ways started to adopt these technologies in terms of thinking about the political potential that they would have. So the strange confluence is one that scholars have referred to as the Californian ideology. Right? It's this bizarre fusion that took place at the time where the bohemianism, right, the kind of hippiness or that you would encounter in San Francisco, for instance, again came together with the kind of sleekness of the high-tech industry, right? And again, these two seemingly opposite things kind of coming together through their mutual faith in the emancipatory potential of these new information technologies for a new kind of digital future where you could be both hip and rich. So what emerged from this, again, bizarre confluence was, for instance, texts such as a Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace, right? So the idea that the internet is not just, you know, a bunch of cables put together, but it offers a kind of alternate space, right? Cyberspace, this kind of new space with new kind of political potential, right? And with new kind of democratic possibilities. Who would be leading this new kind of venture into this new cyberspace? Well, this is again where hackers started to take a more prominent form, right? Because again, hackers would be the ones who have the technical skills, you know, maybe not the political or historical knowledge, right? But would have the technical skills in order to be able to create and to open up this new space. And you know, if you followed 1990 cyberpunk culture, what you saw was a lot of this idea, right? That, you know, kind of corporate nobody, but if they were to have the right technical skills, they could become this like superpowered individuals that would liberate society from this kind of authoritarian regimes. Fast forward a few years, right? And you see the same idea now manifest, right? Again, the figure of the hacker hero now becomes realized through figures such as Mark Zuckerberg, for instance, right? The idea that, well, technological development, you know, doesn't necessarily abide by the rules, right? It's about moving fast and breaking things. you see this focus, again, not on regulation, but on disruption, on innovation, right? With the blockchain, you get this idea that, well, maybe we don't need to trust social institutions to act as intermediaries, right? Now we can have technologies that will allow us to participate in these processes without having to rely on these kind of bigger entities. So I've mentioned a few examples of, again, this kind of historical confluence, but maybe the most emblematic example is Steve Jobs, right? Because Steve Jobs really, in many ways, captured the zeitgeist insofar as, well, he pushed forth this idea of the personal computer. Again, computers in his mind were not meant to stay in labs, right, be them academic or military, right, but we were supposed to welcome them into our home. And there would be a kind of liberatory potential that would come with that, right? And again, a similar message is expressed with now Apple Intelligence. Again, it's not just about having those computers in our homes, now we can have them in our pockets, right? So just to make the point very, very clear, I want to show you a commercial for Apple Macintosh that was released in 1984. And it makes references to the novel of 1984. By show of hands, how many of you guys know George Orwell's 1984? Okay, excellent, right? So it's this kind of authoritarian government that is central to the story. So let me show you now the way that Apple advertised their product.
We celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the information purification records. For the first time in all history, a garden of pure ideology, where each one may bloom, secure from the pests of any complicated influence. Purification, of course, is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, with one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves dry, but we will provide them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
Okay, so what we see there is, again, this idea that expresses a kind of political perspective very firmly, right? It's that, once upon a time, society grew to such a scale where this kind of immediate peer-to-peer relationships were no longer possible. Then we relied on institutions to help mediate these kinds of social or economic relationships, right? So things like schools, things like banks, things like governments, for instance, they were acting as intermediaries, right? But then again, from a certain perspective, we might perceive this as being black boxes, right? As being somewhat bureaucratic, as being maybe even corrupt or incompetent in so many ways, right? And the idea is that now technology can liberate us from that. Right? The idea is that technology can liberate us from these institutions, creating this kind of newly, more immediate, more pure kind of distributed network within which the political possibilities are clear, right? We can think about this movement of decentralization, right, away from social institutions towards technology-enabled distributed networks. We can think about it very firmly as an act of democratization, right? So to put this in our hands, right, we can say quite plainly is an act of democratization, according to this perspective. But there's another side to the story, right? So that was just one way to answer the question. The other way to think about this traces back to a number of scholars, but very famously to Langdon Winner. In 1980, he published an article called "Do Artifacts Have Politics?" And there he was looking at more menial objects, such as bridges, for instance, and saying, well, a bridge, it's concrete, right? How can this be any kind of political object? But then part of the story that he tells us circles around New York in the 1920s, right? A famous architect named Robert Moses. And Robert Moses, having designed this particular highway that would allow people to more easily reach Jones Beach, right? So people from New York could reach Jones Beach in Long Island. Now, the thing is in the way that he built the highway, right, the kind of passageway for vehicles to go through was relatively lower than was the standard at the time, right? And the situation that resulted from that was that cars could go through, right? So cars could successfully reach this beautiful beach, right? But public buses could not, right? Now, of course, at the time, the only people that had cars were very affluent individuals, right? And the masses that relied on public transit, right, which were primarily people of a lower class or people of color, then could not, right? So what does Winner make out of all this? Of course, he says some of it traces to Robert Moses' own kind of inclinations, but he says much more important than that is the fact that any technology, right, no matter how seemingly neutral it seems, right, even a bridge, for instance, never occurs in a kind of social and political vacuum, right? It always occurs in society where there are different political differences and where there are different social hierarchies. So again, as you introduce a technology within this context, right, either intentionally or unintentionally as a result, you might reproduce or reinforce those same differences. So, you know, scholars have talked about this a lot over the past few years, right? So this relates to phenomena such as algorithmic bias, right? So the idea that you create a product based on machine learning, for instance, a particular kind of technology that uses the past to predict the future, right? Well, I mean, again, what's going to happen here is that it's going to use the past to make recommendations. And if those past have certain social differences, it's only going to reproduce those social differences. Even looking at other seemingly more innocuous technologies, such as an Amazon Echo speaker, for instance, right? We all have this, and you know, it's great. It allows us to play music, for instance. But it's also the result of a very complicated supply chain process within which the work of a lot of people around the world is involved. And it involves certain conditions, such as, for instance, people in Africa mining the resources that are necessary for the production of this technology, manufacturers in China that are working in slave-like conditions, right? It involves the exploitation of workers, even here in the United States, in the shape of delivery drivers. And again, even questions about our own role in it, insofar as we are the ones that provide the data for the production of this particular technology. Now again, you can say, well, you know, the subject is great, a lot of us enjoy it. And that's no doubt. But again, we have to think about the benefits, right? No doubt some people are benefiting from the creation of this product a lot more than other people around the world. So this is all to say that as we think about this transition, right, as we think about the transition from this kind of institutional model to a more kind of distributed model, it's very important that we think with specificity what institutions here we're talking about, right? What are the institutions here at play? If, of course, these institutions are taken to be entirely corrupt or incompetent, well, then yeah, it would make sense that we would try to replace them, and it would make sense that technology would open up this new kind of democratic future. But what about when that is not the case, right? What about when we're talking about other institutions that are there for a reason? So we might think about journalists, for instance, who historically have played the role of protecting truth, of protecting the public sphere, right, of acting as watchdogs against corrupt government officials and such, right? So what if we think about journalists, and then we look at the history that has ensued with Facebook and Twitter kind of opening up the channels of communication, right? Obviously, this act of decentralization opens up great democratic potential, as we have seen in certain circumstances where authoritarian governments are controlling the flow of information. Well, yeah, of course, this is exactly what we would hope for. But it also opens up the floodgates for a number of other nefarious phenomena, such as fake news, such as cyberbullying, such as hate speech. Let's think about regulatory institutions that are there to protect workers, for instance, right? That are there to make sure that there's a minimum wage, there to make sure that workers receive benefits, right? That they're not discriminated against, right? So again, you have this kind of regulation, and then you have something like Uber come about, right? And well, yeah, Uber, you know, is very convenient in a lot of ways, right? And it also, no doubt, offers opportunities to workers that they otherwise might not have. But again, here the other side is that it also begs a number of questions as to, well, it offers people jobs, but what are the actual conditions for these jobs? And are some of these rights that people have fought for a long time, are those being respected? And again, how is this business being allowed to proliferate around the world? As a last example here, we can think about financial institutions, right? Wildly unpopular after the 2008-2009 financial crisis, right? But again, they were there to serve a purpose, right? To protect consumers against certain financial predatory practices. Then you have something like blockchain come about, right? And there the idea is that we could replace banks or financial services now with this technology. And some people will argue, look, it's democratized wealth, and even certain governments around the world are using it, right? And you could argue that to some extent that may be true, right? But it's also opened this plethora of criminal activity, right? And again, by removing the job of banks and other kind of government-regulated institutions as providing that kind of protection against customers, well, what we see is a whole slew of illegal practices. So what the question that I'm leading to here is to say, well, if we look at this transition, again, we might very kind of superficially say, well, of course, decentralization is the same as democratization, right? You're moving power from institutions to the hands of many, right? But what I want us to think about is, well, is this always the case, or is this necessarily the case, right? Because, again, going by some of the examples that I showed, maybe there's reason for us to think that moving power away from these social institutions doesn't necessarily lead to a greater democratization or to this kind of notion of a distributed network. It instead opens up these vacuums where new kinds of black boxes can emerge, where new forms of power, of control, of concentration, of political wealth and capital, right, take hold. And again, these may be entities who do not care for democracy at all. So to wrap up here, and again, to go back to the very particular question about AI, right? We've examined these claims as to whether, AI enhances democracy, right? Whether AI has a potential for this new kind of democratic possibilities. And what I would suggest for us to answer that question is, again, that we look very specifically at the institutions that are involved in this transition, right? What specific institutions are we here talking about? You might say, well, yeah, let's use AI to democratize access to knowledge and skills, to democratize education, right? That sounds fantastic, right? I'm entirely on board with that. But again, following Magnum winner, this doesn't happen in a social and political vacuum, right? So what happens when we're using AI to democratize knowledge and skills in education, but in a context where educational structures are being dismantled, right? What happens when we're doing this in a context where experts, right, in the shape of researchers, for instance, right, of academic researchers, who are the ones who normally orient and manage education, right, who manage kind of technological and scientific education, right? What happens when the funds necessary for them to do their work are being deprived? So again, we can think about this as a process of democratization, but if we don't have those educational structures in place, if we don't have the experts in place, well, what kind of democracy are we talking about? Similarly, you might say, well, let's use AI, right, to democratize creativity. Let's use AI to democratize governance, right? And again, all of this in theory sounds fantastic, but when we're looking at it in practice, some very important questions emerge, right? As we democratize creative work, well, what does that mean for creative workers, right? And is there a system in place to prevent that the accumulation of capital that results as creativity is supposedly democratized doesn't merely accumulate in the hands of those tech developers that came up with these technologies to begin with, right? And perhaps even more importantly, as we think about using AI to make governments supposedly more efficient, well, maybe we need to think about the fact that governments are slow and bureaucratic and redundant for a reason, right? Part of what we have to think about is, well, what are the systems there to ensure checks and balances, right? And to ensure that as capital and as political power moves from one hand to another, right, that it still respects those democratic values. So, again, the final question that I would like for us to ponder here is, well, we're thinking about AI as being a part of this transition, of the so-called process of democratization, but is it the case perhaps that AI is involved in a process of democratization that is actually undermining democratic institutions? What does a democracy without democratic institutions even look like, right? We can think about democratic institutions as doing two things. One is, of course, promoting what here David Harvey calls the good freedoms, right? So we obviously want the freedom of speech, we want the freedom of association, of religion, to choose one's job, right? The freedom for us to be able to have this kind of conversation, right? And again, that seems very important to democracy, given its emphasis on autonomy and freedom. But there's also other freedoms, which is what Harvey calls the bad freedoms. And that, for instance, includes the freedom to abuse or to exploit others. Hey, that's a freedom too, right? The freedom to exploit others, the freedom to make inordinate gains without commensurate service to the community, the freedom to benefit unfairly from technological innovation, etc., right? So again, democratic institutions are the ones that normally negotiate these two and try to disentangle one from the other, right? So again, and to conclude, as we're thinking about the role of AI, we have to think about them in relation to these democratic institutions and to what vision of democracy we want for the future. Thank you.
I will say when I agreed to give this talk about a year ago, the situation with democracy was a little less fraught, and so I hope this doesn't come across as kind of myopic and self-indulgent and shying away from difficult political questions. This is a slightly different kind of talk than the one we just heard, which was extremely thought-provoking. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is the fact that you can't tell at all, but going on around you right now is a spectacular exercise in direct democracy, effectively, being carried out by a whole bunch of, entities without actual will, but the building blocks that make up all the matter in this room and all the matter that you interact with is effectively voting right now. What do I mean by that? Well, here's a water molecule. There are a lot of water molecules in the world, right? One water molecule does not really have a property called wetness. One water molecule is just one water molecule. But if I have a whole bunch of them and I put them all together, somehow this ensemble of water molecules decides whether it should be the water vapor that is floating around this room right now, or whether it should be liquid water in a puddle on the ground, which drains out of our overflowing air conditioning condensation vents, or whether it should be a snowflake, right? Whether it should be a solid. How does that decision get made? How does the material around us end up picking the form that it's in? And I will try to explain briefly that effectively it's done by voting. All right? So hopefully this will become a little more clear in a few minutes. So let me back up for a second. So there's a popular view of physics that is propagated by shows like The Big Bang Theory and things like The Elegant Universe by Brian Greene and all sorts of other pop culture things, The Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. There's this popular idea that physics is all about finding the ultimate building blocks of matter and understanding the origins of the universe. And we do this by doing things like building immense machines in Switzerland and smashing particles together at nearly the speed of light, and we watch where all the little bits land, and somehow we're able to back out information about how the universe works from that. Or, we build amazing satellites and complicated astrophysical tools. We look out and we gaze out upon the stars and look at astrophysical data and somehow infer, again, deep, profound truths from there. but it's all kind of an exercise in reductionism, right? We're trying to dig down to the smallest building blocks, the smallest constituents, and understand those rules. And the idea here is that that teaches us how the universe is. Let me give you an alternate view, which is that there is deep and profound physics going on all around you all the time. And I will say that our understanding of the rules, the organizing principles that describe everyday matter, it sounds less sexy and less exciting than colliding particles in a huge accelerator, but it's an amazing intellectual achievement what we've been able to figure out. And it really is pretty remarkable what goes on and how much we actually do understand. So the properties of collective material when you've got lots and lots of building blocks are emergent, right? They don't result, I defy anyone to start with the standard model of particle physics and predict that that snowflake image I showed you from before from a fantastic website by a professor at Caltech, that snowflake is going to have six-fold symmetry, okay? You get properties that are not simply or obviously connected to the smallest underlying building blocks. And I will say, it's kind of an aside, many material properties actually can be described by math that looks a lot like particle physics, but that's kind of beside the point today. So what I'm really saying is that there is this tension between reductionism, which is this idea that I look at our fundamental particles and I can write down all in great detail all their minuscule properties and how they interact with each other. But does that in any meaningful way imply snowflakes or superconductors with magnets levitating over them, or liquid crystals that are responsible for a bunch of the display technology in all of your handheld devices, or things like ours, right? And I would say the answer is no. There is not a simple direct connection from any of this to any of this, because the properties here are emergent. Now, I know there are philosophers who will tell, we can have a long debate about what emergence means from the point of view of actual philosophy, and that's more subtle than I want to get today. So my discipline, my subdiscipline is what's called condensed matter or solid state physics. It did not get off to an auspicious start because people were very curious about the properties of matter way before they knew even that they were built out of atoms, right? So there was a lot of hand waving, a lot of fudging, a real hodgepodge of ad hoc ideas. This is Wolfgang Pauli, a very, very famous Nobel-winning physicist who was also famously acerbic, and he once made the statement, Festkörperphysik ist eine Schmutzphysik, which is German for solid-state physics is the physics of dirt. Basically says you can't understand any of this, it's hopeless. Pauli also had another good line, God made the bulk, but surfaces were invented by the devil, which is fun. And Sheldon Glashow, another Nobel Prize-winning physicist from Cornell, once referred to this as squalid state physics. Really somehow beneath all of us to be worrying about these concerns. But in fact, it really governs all of the technology around you and all of the properties of why this podium feels the way it does, why does it feel slightly cool to the touch, all of that. Okay, so let me talk about states of matter, because that's really the motivating thing here when we're talking about this idea that matter in some weird sense is voting all the time. What are the states of matter? Well, we learned these in elementary school, right? There's solids, there's liquids, there's a gas. This is supposed to be like a mist over a body of water of some kind. If you went to a really exciting, progressive, exotic school, they would tell you maybe there's a fourth state of matter called plasma, but that's because they just wanted to play with these cool plasma ball toys. So how did we decide that these are states of matter? What is a state of matter? A state of matter is when you've got a substance or a material where its collective properties are spatially uniform and constant, right? So anywhere within this ice is like anywhere else within this ice. Anywhere within the water is like anywhere else within the water. And we have these three broad categories, solid, liquid, and gas, because we're able to, with our unaccelerated, unenhanced senses, we can immediately tell they've got very different mechanical properties. So what do I mean by that? So, what's a gas, right? It's made up of little particles that are at low density. That means they're mostly far away from each other. They're wandering around all the time, right? The energy of each particle is much bigger than however they interact, so they basically just bounce off each other and move around, and they mostly don't talk to each other. And you may not ever think about this, but mechanically a gas, it's compressible, meaning I can squeeze it. So if I take a balloon, I can squish on it. And it also has what's called no shear modulus. That just means it takes the shape of whatever container it's in. right? If I took a piece of some amount of gas and I tried to move the top surface of it past the bottom surface, it would just slide, no problem. Right? So a liquid, I still have it made up of little particles. We're at a higher density, right? Now the typical separation of the particles is comparable to how big the particles are. They're bumping into each other all the time. So interactions must be strong because they're bumping into each other, right? It's nearly incompressible because they're bumping into each other, right? So I kind of can't squeeze water very much. You all know this from experience. And because it pushes back, right? If I try and squish water, it pushes back on me. But again, it flows, right? If I push on it, it flows, and it'll assume the shape of any container it's in. And then a solid, well now, the particles might still be jiggling around, but they're really cheek by jowl in there. They're really up against each other. And now it's not just incompressible, but you can't even deform it sideways, because now if I try and slide the top of this lectern past itself, it pushes back on my hand, right? So gas, liquid, solid. There you go. So how do I actually understand the properties of materials? Well, the answer is you have to do statistics. And a gas is one of the easiest ways to think about this, right? There's something like 10 to the 28 gas molecules in this room. That's a 1 with 28 zeros. That's a lot of gas molecules. They're mostly pretty far apart, but they're floating around the room all the time. It is hopeless, if I want to understand the properties of the air in this room, to follow in some weird way like Newton's laws for every gas molecule. That would be crazy. So you can imagine, here's a couple of gas molecules in the middle of the room somewhere. They come together, they bounce off each other, they go off in space, right? Trying to keep track of all of those interactions would be incredibly difficult, basically impossible. But the good news is we don't need to. We don't care about what every particle is doing. Do you care that the air in the room right now is in a slightly different configuration microscopically than it was when I started this sentence? No. Because if you zoom out, if you really take a fuzzy view of things, right? If you take a statistical view of everything, the macroscopic picture of the air is the same. Even though the individual air molecules are moving around all the time, on average, if we look at the big picture, nothing is changing. Nothing on a macroscopic scale is changing. Okay? So we only care about a small number of macroscopic properties. Again, here's a snapshot of the air in this room now, and here's a snapshot of the air in this room a few instants later, right? And these look rather different. The molecules are all oriented differently. They're all in different places. But honestly, if you zoomed out, they just look like a gas. They look like a uniform gas when you look on long scales, right? So the microscopic states, the microstates are different, but macroscopically it's the same. And that's the key. That's how this voting thing is going to end up working, right? We don't need to track a 1 with 28 zeros number of particles. We only need to worry about these macrostates, and we're really lucky that they're described by only a few numbers, a small number of numbers, right? So some of these things are what are called intensive quantities, which means like if I make the room twice as big, they don't change. So like the pressure, the air pressure in this room, the temperature in this room, which is a little cold actually, the density, so the number of gas molecules per unit volume in this room is an example of an intensive quantity, right? There's a few things that are extensive, the volume, the actual particle number, this thing called the entropy, which we'll talk about in a minute. I left out one called the chemical potential. That's kind of elusive even to physics students, so I'm not going to talk about it unless people really have questions. So how do these decide whether to be a solid or a liquid or a gas? And the answer is they vote. Okay? The state of matter that we observe, whatever we happen to see, is the one that corresponds to the largest number of microscopic ways to arrange everything, subject to whatever constraints we're under, right? So basically, whichever macroscopic state gets the most microscopic configuration votes, that wins. So it's all about counting, right? But we've got constraints. So there's different ways to do this, and in physics we have, have three major different ones labeled. The one we're going to care about in this room is, well, we've got a certain amount of stuff. We're sitting at a certain pressure and a certain temperature, and that's the conditions under which we want to count our votes, right? So I could say to you, how many different ways are there to arrange the nitrogen and oxygen molecules in this room? I could arrange them kind of scattered uniformly around the room like they are, or I could have them all be, I could have a block of solid nitrogen and a block of solid oxygen, and the whole rest of the room is empty. Or I could have a puddle of liquid nitrogen and a block of solid oxygen or something like that. I could do all sorts of variations of these things. I'm telling you, the one that wins is the configuration that wins, which happens to be gas molecules spread uniformly around the room. That just has the biggest number of ways it can be done. So it is basically a weird kind of popular vote. And so even exotic things like this is a crystal of bismuth. Like, why does bismuth do this? If I take bismuth atoms and I melt them and I put them on and I then bring them back to room temperature, why do they arrange themselves in something that looks like this? Because that's the most likely way they can arrange themselves, given the constraints at their disposal. So this is kind of like, we sometimes talk about the Copernican principle in astronomy. The Copernican principle was, Copernicus was one of the people who advanced the idea that the Earth went around the sun, that the Earth was not anything special. It was no different than any of the other planets. Everybody goes around the sun. So Copernican principle is shorthand in science for saying whatever you're seeing is completely typical. You're not a privileged observer in any way. Whatever you're seeing is somehow typical, right? So the reason this direct democracy of counting matter works is because the numbers are staggeringly huge. There are no close elections, okay? There's no hanging chads, there's no recounts, right? Let me give you an example. So why does the air in here fill the room? Like, why do we always see this? Why don't we ever see this? There's nothing against the laws of physics that says the air in this room couldn't all spontaneously end up by the ceiling. I mean, we'd all be very sad if that happened, but there's no reason it can't happen. So why don't we ever see that? The answer is, it's way less likely than this. Let me give you just a very crude estimate of this, okay? So this is a little bit for the math inclined. I can divide the room up into tiny little cells, and I can just figure out, how many places in a room of volume V are there to stick each molecule, right? And the number of ways, we like to use the Greek letter omega for this, the number of ways you can arrange all the molecules ends up looking like this V over the size of a cell to the power n, where n is how many molecules you've got. And then this 1 over n factorial just takes care of the fact that actually every nitrogen molecule is truly the same as every other nitrogen molecule, so it doesn't matter if I swap these two. They're exactly the same, so those states are the same. And then if I consider the case where like the volume is half as big, then I basically have V over 2 instead of V here, right? And once I raise it to this capital N, which remember is 10 to the 28, a 1 with 28 zeros, what you find is the ratio of votes for half container over votes for full container is something like a 1 with 29 preceding zeros, right? Basically, if all configurations are equally likely, this is incredibly rare. This just does not happen compared to the overwhelming majority of the time you get this. So this is a winner in a landslide, okay? And that is happening around you all the time. So I always like this cartoon. This is the Department of Entropy. It looks very sad and broken down. So entropy gets a bad rap. Entropy, you've all heard this expression. You'll have this idea in your head, if you've heard of it, that it has something to do with disorder. That's not really correct, right? Entropy is basically a way we do this counting. So these numbers, these omegas, are so big that we don't like to keep track of 28 zeros. We just take the logarithm of these numbers and just keep track of 28. We remember that 28 it stands for the number of zeros, right? So we count the number of microscopic states by taking logarithms. And so this thing that you've all heard of, this idea of the second law of thermodynamics, entropy always increases or remains the same. It's the idea, right, that if you just let a system go, if you just let nature go, it tends toward the macroscopic states that can happen in the most possible ways. So really, nature is sort of voting all the time around you about whether the air in here should be a solid, a liquid, or a gas, whether the water in your water bottle should spontaneously solidify. There's no reason why it couldn't. It just, under the circumstances you have, it's vastly less likely than it remaining a liquid. Now, an analogy to free and fair elections is this idea, so it's also called ergodicity. It's the reason this works is that I'm assuming that the little building blocks can get to all the possible states, that they can sample all the possible states, and that's how we're getting our voting to take place effectively. But what if they can't? Like, what if they get stuck? What if you can't really get to all the possible configurations? And people really study this. This is a kind of a cool, this is a filmed experiment, actually. These are like glass beads. And yeah, under the right circumstances, you can get what's called jamming, where the system locks up. It can't get where it wants to go. It can't get to the most, clearly energetically, the most favorable thing here would be for all these beads to end up down here at the bottom of the hourglass, but they can get stuck. Here's a kitchen example from my own kitchen. I wanted to make risotto. I actually took this picture about 3 years ago during the pandemic, or longer ago, I guess. I wanted to make risotto. You buy risotto, the arboreal rice, and it comes vacuum packed, and it's in a little plastic thing, and that is as hard as a brick. You can't move it at all. The rice grains can't move whatsoever because they're packed in so tightly. You let a little bit of air in there, and then suddenly the whole thing is soft and pliable. Right? It's like a beanbag. So once you cut this vacuum and let a little bit of air in there, now these things have enough room to move, and it's not jammed anymore. So an example of matter that does do this, where you can't really explore all the options, is a glass, it turns out. So if I take silicon dioxide, a crystal of silicon dioxide is quartz. You've all seen what quartz looks like at some point in your life, right? I can take that crystal, I can melt it, I can cool it super, super quickly, and the lowest energy, the most favored state, what that thing would sort of like to be, is a crystal, but it can't get there. So instead, it gets hung up and forms a glass, where the structure is much more complicated and messy. It looks a lot more like a liquid. It's just not jiggling around. Right? So that's an example of where the system the vote is never complete. The system never really reaches equilibrium, even though it kind of really looks like some kind of a state of matter. So let me finish up. Let me give you a couple little take-home messages and questions to ponder. So, like I said, the states of matter that you see are determined in some weird sense by voting. Matter likes to take on the configuration where it's the most possible microscopic ways to get a certain macroscopic behavior. And because of the large numbers involved, the elections are landslides. And here's me using AI. I actually generated an AI image of a big pile of blue ballots next to a small pile of red ballots. Don't read anything into the color. So questions I did not talk about, right? Why are the states we see so clearly defined? What are the organizing principles at work that really determine exactly what states you do see, right? Why does ice have a particular structure and not some other structure? Why are snowflakes 6-fold symmetric and not 8-fold symmetric, right? And what are the emergent properties of those states? Why does ice have the speed of sound that it does? Why does it have the optical properties that it does? Well, that's really the discipline that I work in, right? In some sense, what condensed matter physics wants to do is it wants to understand all the possible states of matter, why they are what they are, and why they have the properties they do. Okay? So, that kind of study has really paved the way for all the wonderful modern technology that we're using for me to present this talk and for you to watch it and for you to, surf on your phones while I'm giving the talk. So that's it. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
All right, thanks.